Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. Joining us to kick off this week on what is one of the more impactful Supreme Court rulings in a week and a half full of them is Colleen Hroncich, policy analyst with the Cato Institute. Colleen, how are you doing? And I hope you had a wonderful Independence Day weekend.
I did, absolutely. Great. Thank you so much for having me on, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Well, and when the Supreme Court comes in and says so eloquently and so clearly that if you're going to give government funds to a parent for whatever it may be, you cannot prohibit them from giving them to the institution of their choice. In this case, the parents in Maine who were giving the school tuition assistance money to a parochial institution. Take us into the Carson ruling and why it's going to have ripple effects beyond just this one ruling and what we can see coming from it in the future.
Well, it seems this is a bit of a capstone. It seems like there's, it's been kind of coming this way for the past several Supreme Court rulings along these lines. And this case was interesting because, so back in 2020, the court ruled in Espinoza v. Montana, and that was about a tax credit scholarship program that the state was not allowing families to use at religious schools. And so the family sued, and that's where Justice Roberts said, the line you just quoted, that's where he said it originally, I believe, is, that if you don't have to have these programs, but if you do, you can't discriminate against religion. And the Maine program is interesting because it's a little bit different. It is a tuition assistance program for areas, it's a very rural state, so areas that don't have school or they can pay the tuition for families at public or private schools. And it was set up in 1873, and until 1980, this could be, so more than 100 years of its history, the tuition assistance could be used at religious schools. And then in 1980, it was changed based on the state attorney general at the time. He thought that it violated the Constitution, and so the legislature changed the program to say no longer could you use the funding at sectarian or religious schools. And so that was where this lawsuit came from. And even after Espinoza, the state of Maine decided to pretty much ignore the Supreme Court ruling and try to find some little wiggle room to say that, well, their program was different. And the Supreme Court came and said, no, you're still, if you're going to fund private education, you can't discriminate against religion. So it's kind of an add-on, I guess you could say, to the Espinoza ruling, and one that should hopefully make it very clear to every state that you can't discriminate against religion if you're going to fund private education, you can't discriminate against religion in that. Yeah. And that really upholds the First Amendment. It doesn't violate it.
Well, and does Carson survive, and it has sort of avoided the slings and arrows of outrageous misfortune that some of the other rulings have brought down on the court, maybe because it didn't have the sex appeal of Dobbs or West Virginia versus EPA, but there were some protests, quiet ones, until Dobbs came along.
Right. I think partly, too, is probably because it wasn't that surprising. From the oral arguments and from the previous couple of rulings with Espinoza and a few years before that, Trinity Lutheran, where there was a preschool program that upgraded playground for safety, and they ruled that you couldn't keep a religious preschool from participating in it just by nature of them being religious. So I think that's part of it too. Obviously the Dobbs one is a bigger flashpoint, but then also just the fact that I think the writing was on the wall, so people were it was pretty clear which way this one was going to go, so that may have been part of it as well.
Now, what does this do in context to Blaine amendments across the country, or is it written so specifically because I've heard people say, oh, this isn't going to do anything to Blaine amendments, but I think it could be as I've always argued, it's the money follows the child. It isn't the state giving money to a parochial institution any more than if you use Medicare money to pay a parochial hospital, it seems to fall in the same thing. What is your view of what comes next from this ruling, or if anything does?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, so I'll say that up front, but it certainly seems like between Espinoza and this, I don't see many ways that Blaine could survive. I mean, every Blaine amendment is written slightly differently, so maybe there's some little quirk in one of them that I'm not aware of. I know, like in Michigan, their equivalent of their Blaine amendment, it just doesn't allow any private schools whatsoever. So there's no religious discrimination there. So that's different. But in terms of the typical Blaine amendments where it is, specifically against religious schools, I don't, as a non-lawyer, I don't see how between Espinoza and Carson v. Makin that you would be able to enforce those.
Well, then, and we see some outrageous monies being spent on schools. Here in Virginia, they weren't able to get a real voucher program started, so they created a tax break for additional monies that people who could give to tuition assistance programs. Still very government controlled, but is this something that can be used for folks who really want parents? I know you for many years were a mom taking care of kids, and it's a hard enough job. But to think that some of our school districts are now spending upwards of $16,000 per student per year, and we continue to fall behind the academic standards that the rest of the world is following, that we can start to see when you listen to our governor and our lieutenant governor here in Virginia talking about school choice, and the lieutenant governor especially about money follows the child school choice. Do you think that is going to start bubbling up in legislative chambers more and more around the country?
I definitely think so. We're seeing it already. Last year, it was dubbed the Year of Educational Choice because there were, last count, I think, were 21 new or expanded programs in 18 states, including West Virginia, which was the first statewide education savings account. So that would allow, the state funding to follow a child to whether it's education at home, tutoring, private school tuition. And then more recently out in Arizona, they did a completely universal education savings account. And the governor should be signing it this week, I think. And that is, so the West Virginia program is only for kids who are currently in public school or are about to be entering kindergarten, so they'd be entering school for the first time. Arizona's doesn't have those restrictions even. So it's literally anybody will be able to take a portion of the state funding and direct it to the education that works for them, their families, their children. And so I definitely, sure, go ahead.
Well, and not that I'm here to help one political group or another, but I did speak to some of the folks back when Nevada first tried, and then eventually, I guess the progressive left wound up winning the next election and undoing a lot of their school choice program. But the legislators that I talked to said the Latino community was one of the most avid pursuers of school choice, and in many cases because they were able to use it in parochial settings, because they felt like their kids needed that underpinning to go along with what was going on at home. And far be it from me to be a political consultant for anyone, but it certainly would behoove anyone who wants to grow their support in the Latino community that this is an issue that is very important to them.
Right, and the same with Black families. Black families have long been supporters of school choice because they're oftentimes stuck in the absolute worst public schools. So it tends to be people that are, the current system kind of disenfranchises them that are going to be more vocal. And now you've got, the more suburban parents, the white parents are being more vocal because I think COVID really shone a light on things for them. So it was partly that they realized they don't have as much say as they thought in their public schools. And then partly they found out some of the teachings that were happening. And so it seems like the school choice tent is getting bigger as more and more people are realizing, the current system harms them in many ways. And I think one of the things that's interesting is, going back to Carson v. Makin, it's about religion. That was the establishment of religion or, religious freedom and all that. But religion is oftentimes defined very narrowly by opponents of school choice as if it only means worshiping God. But really, if you look at the actual definition of religion, Merriam-Webster, a personal set or institutionalized system of religious attitudes, beliefs, and practices, a cause, principle, or system of beliefs held to with ardor and faith. So there's a lot that's going on in public schools that under, a broad definition of religion would certainly qualify. Just because it doesn't have the word God in it, people think that it's not religion, but secularism you could certainly define as religion.
Sure.
And so, just having a compulsory system where you're saying to kids, you have to go to this school, and, even if it goes against your values, that right there violates religion. And I think that that's one of the things that a lot of people, whether it's the Hispanics or the suburban parents or inner city parents or white parents or black parents, I think that they're all seeing various forms of this, and I think that that's where a lot of people can look at Espinoza and Carson and Makin and say, yes, these current public schools are oftentimes going against our values.
Colleen Hroncich is on with us, policy analyst with the Cato Centers for Educational Freedom. And your career begins, you have an economics background, Colleen, and I want to tap into that because some of the things and I know The Power, we watched The Power. Terry McAuliffe is not an incapable politician, yet once he realized he had started to hemorrhage support over his statements about parents and their role in their kids' education, so powerful was the teachers union grip on his campaign that he couldn't pivot away from it. He had to continue to say it, even though it was clearly going to be to his detriment. In the economic world of schools, and I know we try not to think about it this way, but doesn't it benefit the rank and file, to use the union term, teacher who is struggling to make enough money to live in the communities that they teach in? If there's money follow the child's school choice, I believe we even have some proof in other places where it's taken effect that it benefits the teachers as well, because the good ones get better compensation.
Absolutely, and this is something that I look into fairly often. I'm even hosting a panel on it in the fall sometimes. I'm going to have some former public school teachers on a virtual panel to come and talk about this, because there's so many more opportunities for teachers as well when you have more choice. I've talked to teachers that have, down in Florida, started their own full private schools because of Florida's scholarship programs. I talked to a former public school teacher in Texas who started a micro school. She was in the public schools, and she realized that she was so handicapped by all the rules and regulations that she couldn't do what she knew the kids needed to do. So she said, I'm done with this, and she started a micro school. I talked to a teacher in Massachusetts recently, and they've got pretty much no school choice up there, but she had gotten involved with a learning pod that came out of COVID, and now she's basically a learning coach for 10 kids who they're getting their curriculum online through an online school, but she's there with them and able to help them and just really help them be engaged and be there for in-person help when they need it. So just the opportunities, so often the actual complaints you hear from teachers, it's not oftentimes about the pay so much, it's about the rules and the regulations and how they can't do the stuff that they know that the kids need. And school choice gets them out of all that, and it can help them make a lot more money. I mean, if you had a dozen kids in your class and each one had a $5,000 education savings account following, right there you got $60,000 right off the bat. Yep. And you can set up part-time schools, full-time schools.
Sure.
I toured a school in Georgia. It's a forest school. Their classrooms are literally in the forest. They just have these little pavilion-type structures for when it's raining. And granted, Georgia's a little bit nicer than Western Pennsylvania weather where I am, but it was amazing. And the kids were so engaged in what they're doing, and they've got the whole world as their classroom basically. So the opportunities for teachers in an environment of school choice are absolutely phenomenal.
As you're talking about that, it strikes me, Colleen, that it also makes education the point of school, not just here's where you send your kids, which sadly has sort of been what the public school system has devolved to. Give us your kids. President Biden wants us to give them our kids even younger, and we'll send them back to you at 18, pressed and dressed and ready for whatever.
Or 21.
Yeah, or 21 now, yeah. So is this at least a great opportunity from a really holistic sense, somebody who is an educational expert, to actually put education at the core of our discussion again?
Absolutely. And one of my kids learned this, several years ago, and it was the root word, the Greek root for the word school. It's schola, and it originally the meaning was leisure, because back then you had to have leisure time to be able to educate. Everybody was focused on just surviving. Oh. And we've come so far from that to where now it's just, going through and checking off boxes and, making it to the next level. And so many kids aren't engaged, and so many, parents even aren't engaged in the whole process. And I do think it is what you say. It's because it's become so institutionalized. And when you don't have any other options, it's kind of hard to it can be frustrating if you have no other choices to think too hard about it, really, right. Because you can't do anything else with your kid, really. And so there have been studies of places like Florida where when they have more school choice, parents are more involved. And that makes sense because they can be. And even just if you think about public schools, at least when my kids were in public schools like 10 years ago, it was very difficult to get involved, whereas in our Catholic school, it was very easy to get involved. They wanted parents to be involved. In the public school, they really didn't. And this was in a small town, and it was still very hard to, you couldn't go and just read to the kids. Everything had to be very regimented. And so, I think there's just the whole system is kind of designed in a way that keeps parents out of it. And I think that as more choice comes in, then not only will it be more welcoming to parents, but it will be more accessible for them.
Is there a concern, while everyone's talking about EPA or Dobbs, that the teachers' unions, Randy Weingarten, et cetera, are strategizing a way to make sure that the elected officials that'll have to write these rules don't come anywhere close to it, and are forewarned that even if it costs them their position, it's better that we let this this sleeping giant lay? So,
unfortunately, just having public schools the way we do, it forces it to be political, because if the only way you can have a say is by convincing politicians that your side is the right side, then, I think we're forced into getting the politics involved. And it's very, very much something people have to watch out for is, that opponents of school choice will use regulations to hamstring it as much as possible. And they'll say things like, if you're going to get public dollars, you have to follow the same rules as public schools. But I think a lot of times those rules are there because the system is a monopoly. So because it's a monopoly and parents can't leave if it's not working for them, I think politicians and regulators have put a whole bunch of rules in place thinking it's basically rules-based accountability versus accountability through choice, but it just doesn't work that well.
Yeah.
And the more you have the broad rules set at a state or even worse, a national level, then those are exactly the problems we're talking about, where the teachers don't have flexibility and the parents don't have flexibility, and it just becomes very bureaucratic. So it's something that we'll have to fight against. But realistically, that's something you have to fight against even without school choice, because we've been looking into this a little bit at Cato, the different rules that are already in place in various states on private schools or even on homeschoolers. And this is going to be happening more and more. I think, pretty much people who want to meddle, they're going to want to meddle whether or not these school choice programs are in place. And it's happening on both sides of the aisle, really, because there was a bill in Georgia that was sponsored by Republicans, and it was attempting to put rules around what private schools could teach, too, in terms of the race issues or the gender issues. And, that's just not the place that the state should get involved. Yeah. Let free people make these choices. And sure, some of them will choose something that you don't want, but that's better than having a monopoly government system imposing these choices on everybody.
And becoming a cash transfer machine in a lot of cases as well. Colleen, last one for you. Then perhaps the West Virginia versus EPA ruling can be used in conjunction with this, because if I read West Virginia correctly, it's saying, hey, you can't just give a bag of money to a bureaucracy and say make the rules. Elected officials are going to have to actually start making these policies and putting their names on it. So maybe both can work in conjunction to this.
Well, the hope is, when it comes to education, that, first of all, that the federal government should just stay out of it, really, because there's no role whatsoever in the Constitution for the federal government to be involved in education. But then also just because it's too big of an issue. It's, for when rules come down from D.C., then that just makes things worse, not better. It complicates things. It adds to the red tape. It adds cost and complexity and hoops to jump through. So, you want things done at most at the state level, and really at the state level, what they should do is as few rules as possible, let the funding follow the kids, let the parents choose where the kids go. And like I said, some won't choose well. I've got 4 kids. I can guarantee you I haven't always made the best choice. But at least when the parents are doing it, they're doing it looking at each individual child and trying to do what's best for them, versus a bureaucrat who doesn't even know them and making rules that's supposed to cover everybody. So, I think that the lesson should be, from state lawmakers, meddle as little as possible, and let parents make the choices that work for their families, and deal with, if there are problems, then deal with those specific problems. Don't try to deal with it through an entire system.
That's a great point, and you talk about, one of the things that I've felt since Dobbs actually is we need to do a better job of family planning, and that's part of it, because parenting is a full-time job, as you know very well. Colleen Hroncich, a policy analyst with the Cato Center for Educational Freedom. I do truly appreciate all the time you've given us this weekend, and thank you for your insight. And let us know about that fall event you have coming up so we can promote it for you, so you get lots of people to attend. And I appreciate your visit.
Great. Thank you very much, and I'll definitely do that.
Coming up next, we get into the Supreme Court's decision in West Virginia versus EPA with the best-selling author of Red Hot Lies, Power Grab, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Global Warming, and The Liberal War on Transparency from govoversight.org. The great Chris Horner next on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.